With a franchise as old as Sonic, it may sometimes seem like they've done every type of merchandise possible. You can think of any sort of product and chances are, Sonic's done it in at least some form. This is especially the case with Sonic figures. As more come out, it's becoming harder to make them stand out from each other. It's very hard to make an action figure that's different, unique, yet still appealing. One line of action figures that did that very well are the ones made by Joyride Studios, a name that should be familiar to many fans of video game merchandise. Opening in the early 2000s, Joyride was a company that dealt with many video game licenses, and they produced many high-quality figures that still stand the test of time to this day. Their main line, officially titled GamePro and Nintendo Power Presents, was a line that focused on a variety of franchises, most if not all of which were featured in, as the name suggests, GamePro and Nintendo Power magazines. Sadly, the company didn't stay in business for that long. Though with that said, what they did manage to put out during their short-lived time is quite impressive. They went all over the place, releasing quality figures for games and franchises such as Super Mario, Super Monkey Ball, The Legend of Zelda, Crazy Taxi, and more. They also had a very extensive line of Halo action figures, which existed as its own separate line. Joyride Studios' line of figures was very prolific at the time, as it offered high-quality, large-scale figures of a ton of franchises at a cheap, affordable price. Their line was so popular, in fact, it even had several TV commercials made for it.
Right. Only the best get casted for reality.
These are nicely detailed.
Anyway, one of the most popular figures they ever released was a set of figures based off of the game Sonic Adventure 2, more specifically the GameCube port of it, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. This set of 3 figures were released in both 2002 and 2003 to coincide with the release of SA2 Battle for the Nintendo GameCube. This set contains Sonic the Hedgehog, Shadow the Hedgehog, as well as a special limited edition prototype-styled Sonic figure. In this video, we'll be taking a look at this set of figures. I'm sure someday I'll cover at least some of the other figures released by Joyride, but for now, let's stick to the Sonic Adventure 2 figures. And with that said, welcome to a look back at the Joyride Studios Sonic Adventure 2 Battle action figures. Now, technically, action figures isn't the most accurate term you could use when describing these. They're actually more akin to bendy figures, as their arms and legs have wires in them, allowing you to bend them. I'm not exactly sure why Joyride decided to go with this, but it certainly makes them even more unique than they already were. And hey, the artwork from the adventure games often depicted the characters with bendy, noodle-like limbs, so it totally works. Anyway, this set of figures were released by Joyride in conjunction with GamePro magazine around the release of Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. As these figures were part of a larger full line, they were split up into different waves. The Sonic figure was released as part of Wave 1, and the Shadow figure was part of Wave 2. The figures were also re-released as part of later waves, but we'll get more into that later. One very cool aspect to Joyride figures is that they often didn't make merchandise for general franchises, but instead for specific games. This figure, for example, isn't just your average Luigi figure, but is instead a specifically released Luigi's Mansion figure, complete with a ghost, the Poltergeist 3000, and Luigi's distinct look from the game. This is the case with the Sonic figures they released, being based off of Sonic Adventure 2. The two figures not only were of Sonic and Shadow, the figures also look like they were taken right out of the game's artwork. These are some of the most game-accurate Sonic figures out there, especially compared to the other offerings at the time. Their accuracy, combined with them being based off of a very popular game, coupled with some other details I'll get into later, have made these figures some of the most desired Sonic figures of all time. Let's not waste any more time and get right into it. Before we begin looking at the figures themselves, I'd like to take some time to talk about the boxes these figures came in. The figures came in bubble-carded packaging, with the front of the bubble having the Sonic Adventure 2 Battle and Sega logos. Above that, you can clearly see the figure inside, and you can get a great look at them even inside the box. You can see the 2 included extras, both of which we'll get more into later. The front of the backing has tons of details to it. The top shows the GamePro Presents logo, as well as an advert for a special offer that was included with the figures, where you could get 2 free GamePro magazines. If you haven't noticed by now, the deal between Joyride and GamePro was essentially a cross-promotion. The figures would promote the magazine, and the magazine would promote the figures. Below that, we have some nice character artwork of Sonic or Shadow, as well as text that reads the characters' names, as well as some more text reading that the figures are from the hit game Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. Other cool details on the front of the backing include the Joyride logo, which can be seen at the bottom corner, the series number so you know what series your figure is from, which is towards the top, as well as this line that goes along the side of the box that reads bonus, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle Codes, Tips and Tricks Collector Card. Obviously this is advertising the included card. Moving on to the back of the box, this is where you can see advertisements for the other figures in the line, as well as the other usual stuff you'd expect. I really like this image they used on Sonic's box, as for whatever reason there's an overlaid faded out screenshot from a Chow race, as well as another screenshot below that. Very strange, but very cool. Below the Sonic image we have another image advertising the Super Monkey Ball figures, and next to that are the Virtua Fighter 4 figures, all of which were part of Series 1. At the bottom there's text advertising what other figures would be releasing, and at the very bottom there's more info on SA2 Battle. Now here's where things get incredible. See, the back of the box is actually a flap, which when opened reveals a full review of Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. Yeah, this is on the box, that's so crazy. This is actually the GamePro magazine review of SA2. The review is what you'd expect. It covers most of what you need to know about the game, shows screenshots, gives fun tips and tricks, stuff like that. Obviously, this is a Sonic Adventure 2 figure, so the included review isn't going to be too critical or anything, but still, it's very cool that this is even here. You don't see much game-specific merchandise nowadays, let alone stuff that goes this far to connect itself to the game. And for the record, the boxes for Shadow and Prototype Sonic also include the review. One last thing I want to mention about the boxes before I move on to the figures themselves is this. On the Prototype Sonic box, there's a sticker that tells you it's limited edition, being one of only 500. While that's to be expected, some non-prototype Joyride figures have a similar sticker to that as well, being advertised as first edition figures. Basically, the first 500 figures made would have that sticker on their box. I've never been able to find images of boxed Sonic or Shadow figures with this sticker, but I imagine it's likely that the first batches of them did have it. I'll mention more about the packaging later, but I think it's time we move on to the actual figures, starting with Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm gonna be pretty straightforward for a moment. This Joyride Sonic figure is one of my favorite Sonic figures ever released. Just wanted to start off with that. And no, it's not just because of the soap shoes, though those definitely play a part in me liking it so much. This figure is just fantastic, and here's why. For starters, like I said earlier, Joyride figures were often extremely game accurate, and that's the case with these Sonic figures. And I'm not meaning they're exactly like the in-game models, but rather with the artwork associated with the game. Many of the details here can be traced back to the key art of Sonic from Sonic Adventure 2. For example, one of the few complaints people seem to have with this figure are its eyes. As Sonic is looking to the side, the insides of his eyes also seem to be a bit misaligned. However, there is a very obvious reason behind both of these seemingly odd decisions. Take a look at the iconic art of Sonic from Sonic Adventure 2. Specifically these two. Not only are his eyes to the side here, but he's also looking downwards, which must be why his irises are positioned the way they are in the figure. It's also possible that the figure's smirk is taken from this artwork as well. The odd looking eyes aren't due to Joyride messing up, it's due to them going the extra mile to be accurate to the artwork. Whether or not that's a good thing here is up for debate, however, as I'm sure many people would have preferred to have this figure be looking forwards. Sonic's head as a whole is very well done, and considering what they had to work with at the time, they translated his look into a physical figure very well. Sonic's face is all very well proportioned, his eyes are expressive, it all looks very nice. One potential issue with Sonic's face could be his nose. The nose itself looks good, but as you can see, it doesn't look all that secure to the figure, so I could see a lot of these figures losing their noses if you aren't careful. One thing I have to commend about both the Sonic and Shadow figures is that most of their details aren't just painted on, but rather are sculpted in. Stuff like Sonic's stomach and the insides of his ears could have easily just been painted on, but instead they're detailed in the sculpt, which makes the figure look way higher quality. Sonic's head all around looks very good. Moving on to Sonic's body, you can tell that a lot of care went into making the figure's proportions very accurate. I really like the proportions on these figures. I feel like the length of, for example, the figure's arms and legs are basically perfect, at least in the context of SA2. Speaking of arms and legs, as mentioned earlier, they're bendable, so you can move them all around. Though to be fair, I actually wouldn't recommend doing that nowadays. These aren't the oldest figures out there, but they do have some age to them, so you have to be careful with them. The arms and legs have wires in them, which allows them to bend. Given the figure's age, I feel it would be really easy to snap the wires, effectively ruining the figure. And here's the thing, once the wire snaps, that's it. You can't repair this figure like you could one with joints. Or at least, rest, you certainly can't easily. You definitely still can bend the figure, just be careful with it. Put too much pressure on them and they'll easily snap. I personally usually keep Sonic in this neutral standing pose while I have him displayed, just to be safe. Moving on, both of Sonic's hands are in fists, which is kind of bland, especially since the artwork this figure is presumably based off of has his hands in much more expressive poses. Though then again, I suppose posed hands would potentially limit the poses you could put this guy in. Fists, on the other hand, are pretty universal. And to be fair, his hands are very well sculpted. Each finger is fully individual and defined, and his glove cuffs look great as well. Looking at Sonic's back, his back spikes and tail are all there and look great, as to be expected. Also, from the back you can see some holes in his arms and legs, most likely there due to the wire inside. Sonic's shoes are what gets brought up the most when talking about this figure. They're soap shoes. Just like how the Sega Prize Sonic Adventure 2 Sonic plush is the only plush of Sonic with the shoes, this is, at the time of me making this video at least, the only figure out there of Sonic wearing these. Which is honestly surprising. The thing is, Sega still owns the design of these shoes. See, they're officially called the high-speed shoes, not soap shoes. They could totally still use these and get away with it, even if they were initially designed as product placement. If any company in the future wants to make an easy Sonic variant, swap out Sonic's standard footwear for a pair of these and you're set for life. However, if this figure is going to remain as the only soap shoe Sonic figure, that's not too bad, as Joyride absolutely perfected them here. Check out all the detail and paint that they put on these shoes. They look fantastic, and easily warrant the hype this figure receives due to them. Sure, this Sonic is great on its own, but the shoes are the real selling point here, as this is the only Sonic figure with them. Just for a moment, could you imagine an alternate timeline where everything was the same, with the only difference being that Sega never signed the deal with Soap, thus meaning Soap Sonic never existed? This figure would have had the normal shoes. Same for the plush. Yes, both of them would still look great, but they'd certainly have way less demand to them. Unfortunately, as of right now, it's unlikely that we'll ever see any future merchandise of Sonic wearing these shoes. Though that does make this figure unique. Not to say it wouldn't be without them though. Compare Joyride Sonic to any other Sonic figure. Nothing else looks like it. The figure could have had Sonic's normal shoes and it still would have been unique and desired. The figure's sculpt is so accurate, so appealing, and the bendable joints, while somewhat problematic in the long run, really gives this figure its identity and makes it stand out even more in any collection. Oh, and the soap shoes are cool too. Sonic's base, while not as interesting as the figure, is very cool. For one thing, it's huge. Comparing it to the figure, it's actually taller. It's also not completely flat either, with the base having a distinct curve to it, which is very fitting for a Sonic figure. The top of the base is where most of the detail is. It's often said that the base is designed to look like a dash panel, hence the arrows pointing Sonic forward. It also has not one, but two pegs sticking out of it, so you can firmly attach the figure to it. The best thing about this is, Sonic doesn't have just one hole in his shoes. Both shoes have two holes in them. The reason this was done was to give you even more options when posing the figure. Two of the holes can be used to just help Sonic stand, but the farther away holes are used for running poses. How cool is that? The dash panel styling isn't just paint details either. Each arrow is sculpted in. The base also has Sonic written on it, in bold red lettering with a contrasting yellow outline. Towards the center of the base is a sticker that reads, GamePro presents Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. Admittedly, it's in a bit of an awkward spot, as when on the base Sonic basically covers the sticker, but it's appreciated nonetheless. The sides of the base have some grooves to them, and the bottom is nearly blank with a Joyride Studios logo embossed on it. Now, the base I have has this grayish color to it, but this wasn't the only base this figure came with. In the 5th series of Joyride Studios figures, Sonic was re-released, and with it came a variant red base. The re-release was basically the same besides that though. That wasn't the only re-release of the figure however, as this also exists. This is a promotional release of the Sonic figure that came in a bag. I was unfortunately unable to find much info on this release, but it sure existed. So with all of that said, how can you get one of these nowadays? Basically, the only way to buy these figures now is getting them secondhand, and given their demand, they often go for a decent amount of money. As for Sonic himself, his price point can often vary. I got my Sonic back in 2013 for just $20. Sure, he came loose and didn't include the card, and yes, he has a few scuff marks, but hey, for that price, it's a great deal. I'd say you can usually find Sonic loose anywhere from $30 to $50, occasionally selling for less. In the box, however, well, those are naturally much harder to find, so they run you a lot more. I'd say a box Sonic is worth anywhere from $100 to $125, maybe a little bit more. It seems the different releases of the figure are all worth around the same price. I could see stuff like the bagged release going for more or less, but I've personally never seen that one for sale. As is usually the case, the prices for these figures vary heavily on their condition, and since these figures came with so much, their price reflects what they're sold with. Well, okay, it's not like if Sonic has his card or not is going to affect the price too much, but I could see people willing to spend more on a more complete package. Overall, this Sonic figure is an absolute must-have for any collection. But let's see if Joyride continued that success with their second Adventure 2 figure, Shadow the Hedgehog. Say hello to what was the world's first ever Shadow the Hedgehog figure. I'd say Joyride really nailed Shadow on their first try. This figure is just as, if not better than the Sonic. Shadow was released as part of the second wave of Joyride figures, a few months after Sonic. Sadly, he was the last Sonic character they ever released, but they went out on a high note with this figure. I just really like the style of these Joyride figures. They look so unique compared to other figures released. This Shadow figure, in its design, is quite similar to the Sonic figure, as they should be, as Shadow does look similar to Sonic. What I'm saying is Joyride nailed the consistency between these two and they look great together. That's not to say Shadow is by any means a copy of the Sonic figure though. This guy has tons of unique design choices that make him his own. Let's start with Shadow's head. The excellent sculpting work we saw in Sonic is once again present here. Shadow's face is captured in perfect detail. They got everything right. The proportions for his muzzle, nose, and eyes all look excellent, and his expression is just right for Shadow. All of Shadow's red highlights are here, including the ones on his arms and legs. Shadow's spikes look fantastic. They perfectly shoot out as they should, they're not too close to each other, not too far apart, and look great from any angle. Moving on to his body, Shadow's chest fur is fully recreated here, and it's even raised a bit to give it some depth. Shadow's arms and legs are once again bendable. However, with my figures at least, it seems like Shadow's wire has held up better than Sonic's. My Shadow can bend a lot better than my Sonic at least. Shadow's hands are a lot more expressive than Sonic's. Obviously, this is to mimic the artwork of Shadow seen on the box. This, along with some other details, really help the figure capture the look of Shadow in SA2. Shadow's glove and boot cuffs look great. They have all the details you would expect and more. Some of the best sculpting work on the figure can be seen on Shadow's shoes. Every single detail is fully sculpted and painted, giving the figure some of the most accurate shoes ever to be seen on a Shadow figure. Shadow's base is basically the same as Sonic's, only this time it reads Shadow. While Shadow's base does still have 2 pegs, Shadow's shoes only have 2 holes as opposed to Sonic's 4. This makes it so that Shadow can really only get into a running pose, which honestly is fine. I imagine those extra peg holes would have lessened the details on the bottom of his shoes. Just like Sonic, Shadow was re-released, though this time the re-release goes a bit farther than just a new base. For the second release, Shadow's packaging was completely restyled. This Shadow was released as part of Series 6, and its box now looks completely different compared to the original release of the figure. The front of the box is pretty interesting, with a unique blue sky-like background that contrasts with Shadow very well. Unfortunately, I'd say the back of the box of this release actually looks a little worse than the original release, as unlike the original, the review of SA2 is condensed and printed here instead of on its own flap. Shadow's card was also changed up, as the original release's card looks like this, while the re-released one was given the sky background to match the box. Actually, I can show Shadow's card in much more detail as I actually do have it. Yeah, my used Shadow that I bought came with it. Unfortunately, my Sonic didn't, so I don't have that one, but this is fine. This card is a pretty nice extra. It's printed on basic cardstock, but the artwork and designs make it stand out and pop. The front has some really nice artwork of Shadow. This is also the same one that's used on the box. The front also has the Sega logo, Shadow's name, and even the ESRB rating for Sonic Adventure 2. Behind Shadow is those same weird faded images we saw in the back of Sonic's box. So, you know, behind this cool sleek art of Shadow is a Chow falling over in the middle of a race. The back of the card is pretty interesting, cause this is where all those tips and tricks are housed. This is another GamePro tie-in, as at the top you can see that these, codes were supplied by the editors of GamePro magazine. Pro tip: if you're moving super fast or upside down, and you're unsure of which way to hold the analog stick in Sonic and Shadow stages, just hold it forward. Pro tip: find special power-ups and extra coins by digging in wall and floor pictures. Yeah, okay, these aren't mind-blowing or anything, but it's a pretty neat addition, I'd say. I always love seeing extras like these come with merchandise, and we still see stuff like cards be included with Sonic stuff to this day. For example, this Tomy Sonic Boom 3-pack of Sonic, Shadow, and Eggman contains special cards of the 3 characters. Shadow's card does use a main series render of Shadow and not a Boom one, but, you know, it's the thought that counts. Going back to the Shadow re-release, it's surprising they would have even gone through with something like this. Many companies re-release their products with very little changes, and while Joyride did kinda do that, they went out of their way to change the base and give Shadow's box a fresh coat of paint for the re-release. Just like the second Sonic release, the second Shadow release had a restyled red base. This one is a bit more interesting though, as for whatever reason, the sticker on it isn't for Adventure 2 Battle, but instead it's the logo of Sonic Adventure DX, the GameCube port of the original Adventure game. You know, the game from before Shadow was introduced? Yeah, that had to have been a mistake. The updated box still has the Battle logo, but the base shows DX, and Sonic's red base still has the SA2 sticker, so I'm not sure what happened here, but it's certainly interesting. As for the rarity of this Shadow figure, it's definitely harder to find compared to the Sonic. Speaking literally here, they made more of the Sonic than of the Shadow. Sonic was re-released a number of times while Shadow was only released twice. It's hard enough to find Sonic, but Shadow is a bit harder to track down. Loose, I'd say he should run you around $40 to $50. I personally got mine for $40. I actually thought that was a little steep at the time, but looking back, I'd say that was a pretty solid buy. Just like Sonic, Shadow's value is much higher if he's in the box. A box Shadow should run you around $100 to $150, and I'd say that price would hold for both releases. We've already covered the only 2 characters Joyride released in this SA2 set. Yeah, the only Sonic characters they made were Sonic and Shadow. Makes sense, cause Joyride's line was really one big collection of a ton of licenses. They had so much to work with, them not focusing so heavily on Sonic is understandable. However, Sonic was one of Joyride's most popular properties. They of course would want to release more stuff under the license, and they did just that. I'm sure all of you are aware of the concept of variants. Basically, creating a fully new figure of a character is expensive. It takes a lot of work, effort, and money to design a fully new figure. So to lessen the workload of running a toy line, companies often repurpose their pre-existing molds. Joyride did this in several ways. For one thing, they did release standard variant figures. It was the original figures, only the characters now had different paint, were wearing different clothing, stuff like that. For Sonic, they sadly didn't do that. So no, we sadly didn't get any Super Sonic or Shadow variants or anything cool like that. There were the base variants that we talked about earlier, but really that's not that much. However, Joyride did have a series of special variant figures, which they dubbed their prototype line. Essentially, this prototype series consisted of pre-existing figures done up in a gray color scheme. This is supposed to emulate the style of factory tests or samples. Yeah, this is worth mentioning. These figures released under the prototype name, they aren't actual prototypes. They were officially released and distributed. To be fair, they did all have a very limited release. Every prototype figure was made at an insanely low number of just 500 pieces each. Sure, it's a pretty cheap and basic marketing tactic to sell more figures, but I think it's cool. The prototype Sonic variant itself is almost the exact same as the standard figure. The only difference is its lack of paint, with the figure being fully gray. Remember how I said all of Sonic's details were fully sculpted in and weren't just paint? That really pays off here. Despite this figure being unpainted, you can still make out nearly everything. The prototype's base is also fully gray. It even lacks the sticker or name print. I'm sure you could infer this, but yeah, this guy is very hard to find. Only 500 of these were made, so even when this figure was new, it was still very hard to find, and I'm sure it sold out quickly. Today, it's incredibly hard to find. Plus, who's to say how many of these Sonics are still left in the wild? I'm sure at least a handful of these prototype Sonics were lost or destroyed over the years. There probably aren't 500 of them still out there. While I normally collect figures loose, this would be one I would fully suggest keeping mint. There are only 500 of these out there. If you manage to get one, it's for the best to keep it in as best condition as possible, so keeping it in the box is an absolute must. You don't want to be the guy who opened a prototype Sonic, decreasing the potential amount of boxed ones down by 1. So, how much is this guy worth? Honestly, that's very hard to determine. It really comes down to how much whoever wants to get it is willing to pay. I've seen prices range from very high to surprisingly low for this figure. In the box, I'd say he runs you a high of $300 with a low of $150, and that's only if you get insanely lucky. Unless you strike gold, you're never finding this guy for cheap. While there are many listings of this figure for way more than that, I rarely see any of those sell, so I'm not sure if he's really worth that. Out of the box, I don't know. Unfortunately, or you know what, actually no. Fortunately, it seems not many listings of this figure out of the box have happened over the years, which honestly is a good thing. It's reassuring to know that a lot of these are probably still left in their box. But yeah, if you're after this set, getting Sonic and Shadow loose is pretty simple. Getting them boxed is pretty tough, but not even that compares to getting this prototype Sonic. But with that said, even all of those aren't nearly as rare as these. That prototype variant Sonic we just looked at wasn't a real prototype, but these are. This image was taken at a toy fair back in 2002 and shows off early samples of the Sonic and Shadow figures. The two show slight differences compared to the released final figures. Some may even say that these look better than the final figures. The Sonic in terms of design is pretty similar to the released one, but the Shadow prototype looks quite different. I really like the look of the head sculpt on the prototype, especially the spikes. The real draw to these prototypes, outside of the fact that, these are Joyride Sonic prototypes, that's pretty big on its own, but no, the real draw to these can be seen here. Yeah, those are articulation joints. These prototypes are not bendy figures, they're action figures. It's unclear why this was the case. I imagine Joyride always wanted these figures to be bendable. Maybe it was just cheaper to produce the prototypes with joints. Sadly, this image from Toy Fair is the one last existing archived image of these prototypes in existence, and it's uncertain where these guys could even still be nowadays, if they even still exist at all. To get more info regarding these, I contacted a former employee of Joyride Studios, and he said these prototypes were, get this, made of resin. These were straight up resin statues of the Joyride Sonic Adventure 2 figures. How cool is that? And that also explains the joints. Man, could you imagine owning one of these someday? That would be incredible. Sadly though, it seems that may be an impossibility, as along with that, my contact also mentioned that these figures most likely met the same fate that falls upon many prototypes, that being that they were destroyed. I just want you to think about that for a bit. These incredible early samples of now iconic Sonic the Hedgehog merchandise were probably smashed, broken, and destroyed. One of the worst things about collecting and looking back at the history of these is finding out all of the things that are simply lost to time. And unless some miracle happens, it seems these two may remain as one of those things that we will simply never be able to find again. I'm sure there was a very rational reason behind them being destroyed, if they were. Obviously, prototypes aren't meant for outsiders to have, or in some cases even know about, but man is it sad to think about. At the very least, we do have this image to document that they did at one point exist, and I suppose that's a lot better than nothing. And that's the Joyride Studios Sonic Adventure 2 figure set. If you're a fan of Adventure 2 or just cool Sonic collectibles, this set is an absolute must-have. Or at least the Sonic and Shadow figures are. The prototype Sonic is more of a, if you have the money sort of thing. If you are on the lookout for these, I'd recommend eBay, as it's where a majority of these end up. Be sure to not pay too much for them though. They're great pieces, but I wouldn't pay loads of money for them. Sonic was by no means all Joyride did, and I'm sure I'll eventually get to covering some of the other figures they did during their run. However, their SA2 figures really go to show everything the Joyride line was about. Cool, unique, collectible, game-accurate figures. And you can't really ask for much more than that. Joyride Studios' run of figures was short-lived, but they certainly left a legacy.